the experience of awe is on a spectrum. So on one end, it's a very subtle thing where you feel a reduction of tension, you feel your muscles relax, you might experience a warmth in your body. We took the word awe and we turned it into an acronym. So the A stands for attention, and the first step is to place your attention on something that you deeply appreciate, value, or find amazing.
So it sounds like the harder you try to create or get to that feeling of awe, the harder it's going to get to actually experience it.
Yeah, and if your audience really is a lot of people who are high achievers, the idea here is don't go with that pattern of working harder to get somewhere.
On this episode of Calmly Coping, I had the pleasure of speaking with Jake Eagle, a psychotherapist, mindfulness instructor, and co-founder of Live Conscious. Jake shared his insights on how shifting levels of consciousness can reduce anxiety and how high-performing individuals especially can reduce anxiety. We also discussed the power of awe and how it can be used as an alternative to mindfulness. Jake's experience in private practice and leading life-changing retreats around the world make him a valuable resource for anyone looking to go beyond the bounds of traditional therapy. This episode is a must-listen for anyone interested in improving their mental health and well-being. Hey, Tati here, and welcome to Calmly Coping. I am here with Jake Eagle today. He is one of the co-authors of the book, The Power of Awe. I'm excited to talk more about the book because I really enjoyed reading it and learning more about the concept of awe and how you can integrate that into your day-to-day to reap the benefits. So it's really great to have you here, Jake.
Nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to this.
Great. So can you tell us more about, because, I'm sure people might be familiar with the emotion of awe, but at the same time, it's something that I think isn't really spoken about often. Can you explain more about what awe is and what got you into researching and focusing on this concept?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. It started for me about 5 years ago when my wife and I moved from the mainland to Hawaii. And at the time, I was personally struggling a little bit because I'd closed my private practice and I was kind of at a loss. And I started a process personally where every day I would look for things in my life that were thrilling, that were exciting, that helped me wake up and appreciate being alive. And the more I did this, the better I felt. And of course, what I was doing is I was shifting my focus. I was looking for the wonderful things in my life. And it was so powerful that I ended up designing and teaching a course called Thrilled to Be Alive. And in that course, I asked people to meditate for 10 minutes a day. And about half the people said, I just don't have 10 minutes a day. I can't spend the time. And so I said, well, why don't you do a micro meditation just for 30 seconds where you put your attention on something that you value or you find to be constructive or wonderful in your life. And so at the end of the course, I always do surveys at the beginning and at the end. And at the end of the course, people who had done these micro meditations seemed to be getting as much benefit as the people who had been doing a 10-minute meditation, which I was surprised about. And in the course, I had a colleague, he was taking it, his name is Dr. Michael Amster. And he and I were both so fascinated by this that we decided to try and figure out what was going on. And so Michael flew to Hawaii, and he and I spent about a week working with my wife also, who has a background in sensory awareness and mindfulness. And we realized that what was happening when we had people do these micro meditations is that there was a shift in their physiology, that they were resetting their nervous system. And so we ended up doing a couple pilot studies. He did one with his chronic pain patients. I did one with my private patients. And the results were really impressive. We saw decreases in depression and anxiety and loneliness. We saw reduction in physical pain symptoms. And so Michael took our results to the University of California, Berkeley, because that's one of the centers. The Greater Good Science Center is one of the places where they studied the emotion of awe, and they have a lot of focus on positive psychology. They were fascinated by this. The lead researcher there is a man named Dacher Keltner, who's very well known in terms of awe research. And so he suggested we do a large study, and we ended up putting it together very quickly at the height of COVID. This is right when COVID was starting. So we focused on doctors, nurses, frontline healthcare workers, and we did a 21-day study where we did a variety of psychological assessments prior and then post-study, and then we followed the participants for several months. And the results were just phenomenal. We saw, again, the significant reductions in things like depression and anxiety, chronic pain. We saw an improvement in well-being and mindfulness. And then we realized we were onto something. And so we ended up writing a book, and we had several publishers who were interested in it. And the last couple of years have been a process mostly of writing the book and getting it out in the world. So that's kind of a long answer to how all of this got started. And I guess the other thing I'll say, and we'll talk more about it, in terms of the emotion of awe, it is one of several positive emotions, but it's a very unique emotion in terms of how it affects our nervous system. Because where some of the positive emotions really kind of jazz us up and get us very excited, other positive emotions help us calm down and be extremely relaxed. Awe is just in the middle. We're fundamentally in a deeply relaxed state, but slightly energized. And this is where all sorts of positive things happen in terms of our physiology as well as our psychology. And I'm sure you and I will talk more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really fascinating because, with my personal experience as a therapist and coach, I often try to encourage mindfulness and meditation. And I notice that there can be, some people are interested in trying it, and many people, there's this like resistance. So a lot of times I don't have enough time, or, I just struggle with meditation. I can't do it. I think there's a lot of resistance that people can have to it. And it seems as though with awe, since it's something that, and how you explain it, the practice is so like that micro dosing, like you mentioned, that it's more accessible to people. So what do you think is there, or what would you say is the difference between meditation and practicing awe?
I think there's a few distinctions. The first one is that there's no resistance. People have no resistance to doing this. My colleague Michael came up with the term microdosing mindfulness. And the fact that people are microdosing, and this is 10, 15, 20 seconds each time you do it. So it's really, we always have 10 or 15 seconds to do something. So where people may hesitate to sit down for 10 or 20 minutes and meditate, I've not encountered anybody who's resistant to trying something for 20 seconds. The other thing that's so profound about it is each time we do it, it resets our nervous system. So the way I think about this is that over the course of the day, our nervous system slowly or quickly gets wound up, and we experience potentially more tension as we go through our day, which is part of the reason people experience more fatigue over the course of the day. But what happens with the awe practice is that we're interrupting that cycle. It's as if you take a spring that's under tension and you release the tension. You open it up. You open up your physiology. You reset your nervous system. And by doing that repeatedly throughout the day, you don't end up with that kind of chronic tension and chronic stress that's so debilitating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think a lot of my listeners tend to be high achieving individuals who struggle with a lot of anxiety and stress. So I can imagine that practice would be really helpful for somebody who is really feeling stressed and anxious and overwhelmed. So you mentioned that it resets your nervous system. So can you explain more what you mean by that?
Yeah, there's 3 steps. I guess I should step back and talk about. We took the word awe and we turned it into an acronym. So the A stands for attention. And the first step is to place your attention on something that you deeply appreciate, value, or find amazing. So it's something that's positive in nature, positive in your mind. Mm-hmm. And then the second step is the W, which is where you wait. And the waiting is just this pause where you give your 110% attention. And remember, you're only doing this for 10 seconds, so it's not that difficult. You're giving 110% of your attention to the object that you find to be positive or something you appreciate. And it could be something in your physical surroundings, but it also could be a memory that you have in your mind. It could be an idea that you have that's a wonderful, stimulating, nourishing idea. So we have attention and then we wait. When we're in the wait phase, there are regions of the brain known as the default mode network. And that's where we tend to have the internal chatter, the busy mind, the self-reflective internal dialogue. That quiets down. That quiets down. And then we have the E, which stands for exhale and expand. And when we exhale, and the exhalation should be a little bit longer than maybe normal, when we do that, at the very end of the exhalation, we stimulate the vagus nerve. When we stimulate the vagus nerve, we're activating the part of our nervous system that helps us calm down, called the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's where I'm talking about the reset that occurs. And for your audience, people who do tend to be high achievers, the idea of quieting the mind is incredibly refreshing, because a lot of people who are highly productive have a very busy mind. And there's a lot going on internally. They're thinking about, what do I need to do next? And how did I do in whatever it is that I just completed? All of that goes away for 10, 15, 20 seconds. It doesn't sound like a lot of time, but it's enough time to reset the nervous system.
Mm-hmm. So then what are the effects of that afterwards? Like, how might somebody feel differently?
It depends. The experience of awe is on a spectrum. So on one end, it's a very subtle thing where you feel a reduction of tension, you feel your muscles relax, you might experience a warmth in your body, and then it builds and it becomes stronger. And for some people that are on the extreme end of a very powerful awe experience, we call it orgasmic. And that's where there's this real tingling sensation throughout our body. And typically, for me, it's a release of energy in my spine. I feel the energy at the base of my spine rising up. And I know that I've had a very significant reset of my physiology when that happens.
Yeah, it's so interesting that that's something that can happen so quickly. And I know you did a lot of research, like you said, at the height of the pandemic, which I could imagine is probably one of the best times to do the research because people are under tons of stress. And, what did you notice in regards to how frequently people need to practice this in order to see the benefits from it?
Yeah, that's important because we ask people to practice a minimum of 3 times a day. And for your listeners, what I recommend, I found this to be very helpful. I do it first thing in the morning. So when I get up in the morning after I do my wake up routine, then I go outside. Of course, it's easy to do because I'm in Hawaii, but I go outside and I look for something where I have a moment of awe. But you could do it in your house. You could do it in your living room. You could do it when you're sipping your morning coffee or tea. You can do this anywhere. And then I always do it once in the middle of the day related to my noontime meal. And then I always do it at night before I go to bed. I go outside and I look at the stars. But, the point is, pick the 3 times during the day that you're going to commit to doing this. There is a belief that if we do something for 21 days in a row, it begins to form a habit. And so that's why we ask people to do it for 21 days, 3 times a day. But to me, the interesting thing is that there's what's called a dose response. So the more people dosed on awe, the better their result. Right? So the research study we did required people to do it 3 times a day, but we didn't limit them to 3 times a day. And we did see greater benefit the more often people do this.
Yeah. So would you say that the more people practice it, then the easier it starts to become over time, like to access that state?
Yeah, something happens where you have what we call spontaneous moments of awe. So I've been doing this now for 3+ years, and I will have probably 10, 15, 20 times a day, little brief moments where awe arises, and I can recognize it because I've been doing it long enough. I know what just happened. And it's just very natural at this point in my life. Now, if I'm having a hard day or I have a lot of pressure or I'm overly busy, then I'm more intentional. Then I require myself to stop and do this, and I'll do it typically once an hour. So I think that in the beginning, it requires an intention, but it's not, don't make it hard. If somebody makes this hard, they're inhibiting the emotion of awe. Awe is a very natural thing. It's nothing that we have to strive for. It arises if we just simply focus on something that we think is absolutely beautiful or something we deeply appreciate. Awe will come.
So it sounds like the harder you try to create or get to that feeling of awe, the harder it's going to get to actually experience it.
Yeah, and if your audience really is a lot of people who are high achievers, the idea here is don't go with that pattern of working harder to get somewhere. Allow this to be easy. Allow this to just be a very natural process. And what happens in the beginning is you end up experiencing awe as a temporary state. You go in and you come out. Over time, the more you do this, the more awe turns into a trait. It becomes a part of your nature. And that's when awe starts to arise spontaneously.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to me similar to gratitude, because that's something that I know a lot of research has been done on. And I'll often recommend to clients and students, like, the importance of just, let's say, once a day, recognizing what you're grateful for. And I know you mentioned appreciation as one of those aspects of awe. So what would you say is the difference between awe and gratitude?
Yeah, the gratitude practices have become very popular. You're probably familiar with heart math, which is based on gratitude, and it's a very effective method. My wife and I developed about 10 years ago a model of consciousness. It's very simple. It says that we go through 3 different levels of consciousness over the course of any given period of time. So the primary level of consciousness that we all live in most of the time is called safety consciousness. And that's where we're very focused on getting things done, taking care of business, staying on task, taking care of our loved ones or our animals. We do whatever is necessary to make sure that we're safe and secure and the people we love are safe and secure. That's how most of us spend most of our time. Next level is where gratitude arises, and that's called heart consciousness. And the way we access it is exactly what you just said. We think about things that we appreciate. We think about things that we're grateful to have in our lives. And what's now happening is we can go further. We can go into what's called spacious consciousness, which is more of a contemplative state. And that's where awe arises. Now, you may have the beginning signs of awe when you practice gratitude. But if you use the awe method that we've created, you can take yourself further. You can go into spacious consciousness. And the difference between spaciousness and heart consciousness is that there are no words. You're no longer thinking. You're no longer labeling. You're no longer trying to find what it is you're grateful for. You've gone to a place that's timeless and wordless. And you're just resting in this space. It's a very expansive experience. And as we experience this expansion, there is a decrease in our sense of ego. So the big self gets smaller as we allow ourselves to expand and connect with things that are beyond ourselves.
So would you say that spaciousness is really intense presence?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
And can you talk more about the ego and how that affects people, and, you know, how maybe the benefits of what going into that place of smaller ego could be?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, but I also want to say that I'm a proponent of the ego. A lot of people are not, right? We talk to a lot of people in spiritual communities who say you have to get rid of your ego, and it's the cause of a lot of our suffering. And I agree that the ego is complex and it does contribute to a lot of our suffering and attachment, but it's also incredibly valuable and necessary and something to be appreciated, not to be thrown away. So what we see happening when people go into spacious consciousness or when they experience awe is the sense of self that we're attached to begins to get smaller, and that creates room for us to connect with something greater than ourselves. So we're no longer thinking about things from an egocentric point of view. It's not just about me and my life. It's more about life. It's more about existence, being here on this amazing planet, going through this experience of a journey of hopefully, 8 or 9 decades, whatever it may be, and how to embrace all of that as the adventure that it really is. So it's not, it's a much less about me and what I do, and much more about being here. As you said before, it's really about presence.
Yeah, and I think that's what many people really want. I know, especially with my listeners, they tend to be in that state of thinking, like the opposite of what you said. The spaciousness is there's no thought. And, I would imagine that when you're in that state of always thinking and striving, and you mentioned that safety mode, does it become harder to access the heart consciousness, the spacious consciousness that you described?
Yes, I would say it is more challenging. When we look at the 5 big personality traits, what we see is that people who are high achievers tend to be pretty high on conscientiousness, right? And I put myself in that category, by the way. We're very focused on how we perform, getting things done, being responsible, busy mind. Those things do make it more difficult. However, another one of the traits is openness. And that's the key trait to accessing awe. If we're open to having a unique experience, that allows us to move more readily into the emotion of awe. And what's so interesting about this is that when we do that, it also decreases the emphasis on our conscientiousness. So in other words, the practice of awe helps those of us who are high achievers and strivers. It helps pull back a little bit on the drive and the intensity and the am I enough? Do I need to do more? All of that starts to quiet down a little bit because we're in a deeper state of presence. Again, it's a word you brought up that I love, and that's really a big part of what's going on. I created a model when I taught that course that was called Thrilled to Be Alive. And in the model, what I said is we can move through our lives using force, or we can move through our lives using presence. And in most situations, we have a choice. Now, there are situations where force is absolutely necessary and required, and when it is, it's appropriate. But much of the time, what I found is that I was using force out of habit, and really all I needed to do was experience presence, being fully in the situation with an open mind, not overly attached to my point of view, and in a state of, essentially a state of trusting that if I'm present and if I'm connected with the people that I'm interacting with, things will work out.
Yeah, I love that perspective, that difference between force and presence. And I could imagine that for many people, it's probably fear that keeps them in that place of force. Would you agree with that?
Not quite. I like the question because I make a distinction in my work between fear and anxiety. And the way I think of it is that fear comes from the primitive part of our brain. Most commonly, people think of it as the amygdala, but I think it's a little more complex. But it is a deeply primitive response we have to threat. And that's when the primitive part of the brain takes over and we feel like we've been hijacked. In my opinion, anxiety is very different. Anxiety does not come from the most primitive part of the brain. It comes from the prefrontal cortex. It comes from, which is what I refer to as the modern brain. It's where our thinking occurs, where we're highly self-reflective and also self-critical, and we worry about things that we can't control. For example, our mortality. We worry about the fact that we live in a world full of uncertainty. And these kinds of things generate anxiety, but it's different than fear, because the only way to respond to fear is the fight, flight, freeze response. And the mistake I think we make is that we often think of anxiety as fear, and we go to fight, flight, or freeze when we actually are doing ourselves a disservice. What we want to do is want to engage the prefrontal cortex. We want to have an experience where we recognize that we're creating this experience by the way that we're interpreting events. We're not literally under threat. It's not like our physical well-being is threatened. The only thing that's being threatened most of the time is our identity. It's our idea of who we are. And that's very different than having a tiger chase us, right?
Yeah. hmm Yeah, I like that you point out that distinction. And I think that for many people, because anxiety can feel like it's such a helpless state, they may not recognize that their thoughts and, worries and identity crisis or whatever you might describe it as is creating that.
So if you're experiencing anxiety and you can label it as anxiety instead of fear, right there you help yourself. And then if you can recognize that you're probably not in a life-threatening situation, so take 3 or 4 deep breaths. All of these small steps move us away from that primitive brain response, and they engage our brain in a much more holistic and healthy manner. The other thing that's incredibly helpful to do is to connect with our body. So rub your fingers together. Think about your feet. Right now, think about your feet. Is your right foot or your left foot warmer? Which one is warmer? Are they the same temperature? Is there more energy in one than the other? All of these things are bringing me closer to a state of presence. And if I can do that, I'm sending a message to myself that I'm not truly in a situation that's life-threatening. Mm-hmm. If it were life-threatening, I couldn't do any of the things I just asked people to do. Mm-hmm. I'd be too busy running.
Yeah, exactly. You would be completely focused on survival.
Right.
And so it sounds like these are grounding methods to help to bring you back into presence.
Yes, and the A.W.E method and the 3 levels of consciousness they're tools to help us become more nimble, more flexible, so we can go from one level to another level. And in my opinion, this work is primarily about learning to shift our state of consciousness, that's where the leverage is. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, it was new to me, but there's research that's been done in the last 10 years that says when people are trying to change, when they're trying to personally develop themselves, that only about 20% of the benefit comes as a result of insight, and that the majority of the benefit comes from what they refer to as muscle building. What they're talking about when they say muscle building is creating new neural pathways. We have to create new neural pathways to get out of our old habitual ways of thinking. And insight is a part of it, but it's not all of it. The key is to repeatedly practice creating new neural pathways. Of course, that's what the A.W.E method is. As soon as I start to think about things I value, appreciate, or find amazing, and then I take that moment where I just give my full attention and I wait and then I exhale, that's creating a different neural pathway.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought that up, the difference between the insight and then putting things into practice, because I often used to think, I used to practice a lot of family therapy, and one of my colleagues would always remind me, like, insight doesn't create change. And it took a lot for me to pull back from that, because I think, especially for me, I want to think my way out of things and think that just more knowledge is going to solve it. But I think that, that reminder that putting things into practice and actually, like you mentioned, changing those neural pathways actually helps to change your experience.
Yeah, and I have a background also in internal family systems and looking at family dynamics. And one of the things I like to do with the A.W.E method is suggest that people use it as a preventative measure, not just in after the fact. What I mean by that is imagine that you're going to have an interaction with a family member, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a child, and you kind of are approaching it with dread. You think it's going to be difficult. So you're in safety consciousness. You're worried. That's what's happening in safety consciousness. If you take a minute, literally a minute or less, and you go into a state of awe before you have that conversation, it completely changes the quality of that conversation because your nervous system is relaxed, you're open, you're receptive, and the other person, of course, picks up on that. So to me, it's a really beautiful way to take a practice like the one you and I are talking about, the A.W.E method, and use it proactively instead of waiting until I feel like I need it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important reminder. So I could imagine it could be something that can be used in moments where maybe somebody is anxious before an important meeting or, a presentation or something else that might bring up nerves that can help them to, like you mentioned, changing that state of consciousness that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can change our state so quickly. And it's a lot easier to change my state before the train leaves the station. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Before my mind has started to take off, I can change my state and completely alter the experience that I'm about to have.
And what if somebody's already in that state? So maybe they're very angry or anxious or overwhelmed. How would you suggest they try and change that state of consciousness?
Let's say that there's a scale from 1 to 10, and 10 is where the tiger's chasing you, and you just simply have to run as fast as you can. I think that, I don't know the exact number, but I think up to, say, a 7, we can use the A.W.E method. And so we could, for example, be having a very tense interaction with someone and have a lot of adrenaline coursing through our system, and we're quite upset. If we were to either with the other person, if they knew about this, or individually, if they didn't know about it, say, let's stop for a minute and let's shift our state of consciousness. I think that we can do that as long as we have built this muscle. So I can do that at this point after having practiced for 3 years in most situations that are psychologically threatening, not physically threatening, but psychologically threatening. I can just say, gosh, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to look around and I'm going to find something that I absolutely love. And what's most effective for me is I have this memory of being with my mom when I was probably 45 and she was 75. And we were up on the roof of my parents' house repairing the roof. And my mom's up there with me working to redo the roof. And it was just such a great image of somebody being vibrant and alive and engaged. And I just love this image. So it's kind of a go-to memory that I have. And so if I do find that I'm getting anxious or upset or too tense, and I don't necessarily see anything in my surroundings that I think are wonderful, I just go to this memory. And I take that moment where I inhale and I imagine that scene, and I always smile and just be with that. And then the long exhalation, and at the end of it, I have this release of whatever you want to call it, tension, anxiety. And it's almost,
that's great.
It works every time.
That's great. So I think even if because if somebody's thinking like, oh, I don't have, the beautiful landscape of Hawaii outside, you can access it in any moment, even by pulling up a memory that you really enjoyed.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I didn't mention this, but all of the prior research on the emotion of awe was based on using some kind of stimulus that was extraordinary. Take a person to the edge of the Grand Canyon, or they would use virtual reality and give people these wild experiences to induce awe. And what Michael and I've done is we have focused on finding awe in the ordinary. And that's a very important point, because you can't always go to the extreme places in the world and see the most amazing things, but you can always access a memory. You can always take a moment and be present and find something in your surroundings that you find to be deeply moving and you greatly appreciate. So it's all about awe in the ordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's so important because, in everybody's busy lives nowadays, it's probably hard to find moments where, you can go into nature or do something that you enjoy on a regular basis. And so, how would you suggest that somebody find awe in their ordinary day to day routine?
Well, a couple ideas. In our book, we have 30 actual exercises that help people find awe when they're cooking, when they're showering, when they're getting in bed, when they're petting an animal, when they're connecting with a partner. So we have 30 exercises in there that are intended to be essentially muscle building experiences. And in addition to that, what I would do or recommend people do is find a memory like the one I just shared with you about my mother. Find a memory that anytime you think about it, it's going to put a smile on your face. And kind of keep that in your back pocket. Keep that as a go-to. And then it may help if you have something in your room that is also a go-to experience. For me, it's a painting on the wall of a scene that every time I look at it, I just feel my heart melt. And so if I'm in my office, I can always look at that photograph or that piece of art and have this profound experience. And I think most of us probably have objects in our lives that if we give them our attention, we will feel ourselves emotionally moved. And those are maybe not something we can carry with us, but we can always carry a memory with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are some excellent examples. And I know that in your book, you have like a 21 days of awe exercise, which I think is great because you mentioned before that, taking 21 days to build that habit. I've actually started that practice myself, and I found that even just taking those, like you mentioned, the 10 to 20 seconds to, I'll look outside my window and see the trees swaying in the wind, and just that experience that I think is there if you are able to tap into it, but we can so often just like walk on by it and not even recognize those things that are always there.
Yeah, and I think you're right. They're always there. I mean, I can do it with you right now. I look at you and I think you created this podcast, and I looked at your bio, and you've been in practice, I think like 13 years or something?
So like 10 years, yeah.
10 years, yeah. And I just thought, what a great way to be living your life and doing a podcast and interacting with people and sharing your gifts with an audience. And I think of that, and it's to me, it's an awe-inspiring concept. But I have to take a moment to be with that. And that's when I get this experience, this physiological experience.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful. And so do you have any, because you shared a lot today, do you have any practical first steps, let's say, for somebody who is feeling in a place where maybe they don't know the first step to take, they're feeling very stressed or anxious or in that safety consciousness that you described, what would you recommend for them to do?
Yeah, I have two suggestions. The first one is to commit to just doing this 3 times a day. Just do this when you wake up, somewhere midday, and at the end of the day. Just take literally, I really hope people understand this. Literally, it's 10, 15, 20 seconds. That's all it is. To find something that is deeply nourishing and moving for you personally. Give that your attention and go through 1 or 2 breath cycles. That's all. That's all. Don't look for a miracle to happen. Just do that and notice what the result is. The second thing is that on our website, which is thepowerofawe.com, there's a short meditation. I don't remember anymore. I think it's maybe 6 minutes long. There's a couple of them. And it's a sweet meditation that allows you to think about your life in a way that you can access and remember the moments of awe. And I think it's a great practice for people who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed or anxious or out of sorts to take, this isn't 20 seconds, it's 6 minutes, but to take that meditation and do it a few times a week is a very comforting practice.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for those suggestions. And, I'm sure that my listeners learned a lot from what you shared today, from something that is so simple yet so impactful. So if they're interested in purchasing your book, learning more about you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, two things. People can find the book on Amazon. It's called The Power of Awe. Our website is thepowerofawe.com, and there are several resources there. There are free practices people can do. There are a couple of meditations, and there will be more. We just started doing an online course, and that course will be turned into an evergreen course, which means people can go through that course at their own pace. It's not quite up, but it will be in the next probably couple of months. And then if people have questions and they send them to info@thepowerofawe.com, either I or my colleague Michael Amster will respond. And if they're about physical things like chronic pain, then Michael will respond. If it's more of a psychological issue, then I'll probably be the one to respond. And we're happy to do that.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So I will place links to all of those resources that you discussed in the show notes.
Okay.
But thank you so much for the conversation today, Jake. It was really enlightening, and I really enjoyed having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.